Technology permeates our daily lives. It is always important to think about what technology should do instead of what it can do. I'm Richard Koh, and welcome to our Tech 101 with our Technology Strategist. Hello everyone, welcome again to our new episode of the Tech 101 with our Tech Strategist. So in this episode, I'm welcoming a returning guest, Marcus T. Marcus, welcome back again.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Okay, so I know that you always have a lot of very interesting, technical topics around Azure to share with us, and this time around is around managed identities. So tell us a little bit more around this topic.
Now, from Microsoft perspective, we are trying to eliminate password from an end user perspective. That's why you start to notice, biometric or MFA without us putting in the credential. In fact, if you ask me what is my password now, well, I've forgotten, right?
That's a very good point. I think similarly for me as well. I think passwordless is the best way to go.
Yes. So we have been doing this in an end user perspective and it has been progressing quite well, right? So in a way, in the cloud, we sort of like thinking, hey, from a backend infrastructure perspective, can we adopt the similar approach? Meaning that when we perform system integration, we no longer need connection string, credentials, certificate to perform this authentication. Can we remove that? And this is where Azure Managed Identity come into picture.
Okay, so that's very cool. In fact, it feels like it increases our security posture with our application. So besides us as end user going passwordless, say in Windows, in Microsoft Office itself, we are also looking at this from our cloud services perspective as well. So this is really cool. Any other aspect that we should highlight to our audience here?
Right. So from a software engineering or when the so-called developers start to create the product itself, it's kind of like a common practice where we put in the credential just for testing purposes, right? But a lot of times, when we push the code to production, sometimes we forgot. Right,
sure.
And this is where the so-called credentials, all these things will be there, right? And as an attacker, when I somehow get access to the service, the first thing I will do a credential scan, right? I just want to find out is there any connection string that I can do, and then try to penetrate to the customer's environment, right? So this is where with managed identity we remove that needs, right? So which means that at the early stage of the project itself, right, the developer no longer need to put in credentials for their testing. They can actually start to leverage on the managed identity in the cloud for their own testing, which means that from day one, there's no password.
So that's cool. So for the audience out there, I think this is a very important development, because when we think about even application testing itself, you no longer have to put credentials and expose the security of your application in that way by doing that. Yes. So as we were chatting just earlier, you were talking about there are kind of three aspects that you want to show us. So tell us a little bit about these three different demos, if you will.
All right. So the first demo, I'll just showcase a very simple scenario on how are we able to retrieve the token. On the second demo, this is where I will showcase how are we able to use this token to connect to databases. And for the third demo, not just so for the managed identity, it's not just limited to the virtual machine side of the things, right? We are actively integrating managed identity to Azure PaaS services itself. So one of the demo I'll showcase is that how are we able to enable managed identity in Azure API management, basically acting as an API gateway, and how can we use this managed identity to authenticate to the backend services. Again, no password.
All passwordless.
Yes.
Fascinating. I think we should go check the demo out right now.
Yep.
Shall we go?
Let's go.
Alright, I'm going to show you a few examples on how we can leverage managed identity. First thing first, I'm going to show you how can we enable managed identity in Azure resources. In this example, I'm going to use a virtual machine. So simply go to identity and you can enable this by toggling this one. And what it does is that it will then register this as a managed identity. Afterwards, you can then assign the role-based access control into this managed identity. As a quick example, I'm going to assign this identity called CTO Demo VM into my Azure Key Vault to retrieve the secret over here. So let me go to the console applications that I built in this application. So as you can see over here, I will have two functions over here. The first function is to get a token, and the function is to get a secret. So in this case, I just need to have one line of code to retrieve the access token by leveraging on the SDK itself. Subsequently, I can use the same token to get the secret from the keyboard itself. So if I run this application, no surprise, I should be able to see both the token as well as the content within the secret. And as mentioned, this token will be in the form of a GWT token, and we can use it for other purposes. A second example would be expanding the managed identity into other Azure resources. One example would be using Azure SQL databases. So in my Azure SQL databases over here, what I'm doing is that I'm configuring it to recognize Azure AD authentications over here. So the moment I enable this, my application can authenticate with the SQL server using managed identity. Again, if I go back to another example, and in this case, I'm still in the same virtual machines, but I'm going to authenticate to SQL and do a select command. So as you can see over here, on top of using the SDK to retrieve the token, I can also use what we call instance metadata services to retrieve the token. And basically, the instance metadata services is a URL that we can call within the environment. Now, again, with this token, I can then embed into my connection itself to open up the connection into the database. As you can see, no credential found in my code over here. So if I run this command, no surprise, I will be able to authenticate and call the API and do a quick select command over here. The example that I'm going to show you is to use API management with managed identity. Again, to enable managed identity, simply just go to managed identity and enable this toggle. And in my case, the scenario would be I want to use API management to authenticate with the Azure storage account so that I can retrieve the file. I have two ways to authenticate with storage account, either using connection string, or in our example over here, we're going to use managed identity. So how do we enable this one? If I go to the APIs, select one of the APIs over here, and if I click on the inbound policy processing, you will see that I'm accepting the additional headers. And again, I just need to include one line item over here to authenticate with the managed identity, and I will have this token so that I can then point to the storage account to retrieve the file. If I go to my storage account over here, as you can see, I can switch to be using the Azure AD authentication to retrieve the file. And if I go back to the API for our testing purposes, right? So this is the same APIs that we have, and this would be the containers and the block name that we want to retrieve. And not surprised, if we send, we will get a 200 OK, and we will be able to get the content. Again, in this example, my API management can authenticate with storage account without any connection string, surely based on managed identity.
Marcus, this was a really amazing demo. I mean, throughout, I don't see any passwords or any credentials, having been embedded inside code itself. Yep. So on that third one, that was interesting that you did. You just toggle managed identity, and that was it. What's the magic that happened behind the scenes?
Well, this is I'm always amazed by the product integration within the entire Azure ecosystem. So when Microsoft rolled out some of these Azure PaaS services, we will start to think about, hey, how do we integrate these particular PaaS services with the entire ecosystem? And obviously, in this case, Azure AD play a critical role. So by enabling that toggle, basically what it does is that we actually register this particular service as an object in Azure AD, so that it recognizes that, hey, this object can receive authentication. And all the heavy lifting will be done by Azure. And from an end user perspective, we no longer need to worry. The moment we toggle, we can start to use a managed identity already.
Okay, so not only it just improves efficiency for the application developer or engineer, it also increases the security posture for the application itself.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So You know, if the audience are interested to, let's say, learn more about this or maybe hear more about this, what would be your recommendation?
Right. Well, as we always mention, right, the cloud is developing in a very fast pace, right?
That's right.
Every day we have like new feature, right? So I recommend to check out this link itself on all the updates. And the demo that we showed today might not be the only Azure services that support managed identity, and the list is growing. And do keep update on the documentation. Sometimes, you never know, there's a new surprise.
New services.
Yes.
So before I let you go, maybe off the top of your head, can you name a few other Azure PaaS services that is managed identity enabled?
Right, so a few, for example, Azure Functions, Azure Storage, the API management that I showed, the Azure SQL, the Azure Blob Storage. Yeah, so just to name a few, these are the common, and one very commonly used, Azure App Services, right?
Okay.
To host the application, right? So these are the so-called commonly used service that has a managed identity enabled.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you again for being on the show. We learned so much from you.
All right, thanks for having me again.
Thank you. So once again, thank you for watching our Tech 101 series. I hope you have enjoyed that and learned a lot about how we are improving security posture for your application through managed identities. We'll see you at the next episode. Thank you.
Bye.